My name's Nick Seaton. I'm the CEO for Australian Parents for Climate Action. And I'd especially like to thank all of the team here tonight for making this possible, and for our speakers, who will be introduced in a moment, and to all of you for making the time this evening to join us. I'm sure you all have very busy evenings, and making time for climate advocacy and our own information and connection is very important, but can come up against all of our other pressures. So thank you for making the time. We're very excited to be hosting this event in the run-up to the federal election, and I'll explain why in a moment. But first, I'd love to ask our co-founder and director on the board, Susie Brown, to acknowledge country before we commence.
Thanks, Nick, and welcome everyone. It's so lovely to have you all here. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of, for me, the Darkinjung and Guringai people, the First Nations people of the lands on which I'm speaking to you from. And I respect that their sovereignty was never ceded. I also want to encourage you to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which each of you are present tonight. We honour and pay respect to the culture, heritage, spirituality and contribution of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their elders, past, present and emerging. And we acknowledge the pivotal role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within the Australian community. We recognise that there is no climate justice without social justice to our First Nations people. Thanks, Nick. Back to you. And you're muted.
Muted.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Susie. And thank you all for sharing which country you're calling in from in the chat. It's great to see such a diversity of locations and respect for our Indigenous Australians. And I'm speaking to you from Gadigal Wangal country in Sydney. And yes, I'd love to introduce our topic for tonight. So we're here to talk about climate impacts, resilience, and the things that we can do, particularly in the lead up to the election. Most of you on the call will know the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has released 3 reports so far as part of its 6th assessment report. These are very seminal reports on the state of the climate. And the focus of tonight's webinar is the 2nd report, which was released in the start of March this year. This report is all about the impacts of climate change, some of which we're already seeing, some of which are locked in, and some of which depend on the actions taken by countries like Australia and other high-emitting countries in the years to come. So in the lead up to the election, we thought it would be a great idea to refresh your understanding of those impacts and empower you to have meaningful climate conversations with your friends, families, and neighbourhoods. Every climate conversation we have helps to increase the understanding and openness we as a community have towards taking bolder climate action. And more than just the bad news, we thought it would be great to arm you with inspiring stories and ideas about what real Australian communities and families are doing to become more resilient against the impacts of climate change and what you can do in your community. And we'll be launching our Where Do They Stand guide, which reviews climate policies of 9 different political parties and a selection of independent candidates who are running in this election. And again, this guide will help you with those critical conversations before the election on May 21st. We'll show that to you a little bit later on. But for now, I'll hand over to David McEwen from our amazing volunteer policy and submissions team, who's done an amazing amount of work tonight to make this possible. Thank you very much, David. And he's going to introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Nick. And I'm coming to you from Guringai lands in northern Sydney. I'm really excited to be welcoming 2 great speakers tonight who are going to tackle the topic from different angles, as Nick alluded to. And the first is Professor Mark Howden, who's the director of the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at the Australian National University, and just happens to be a vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and worked extensively on the Working Group 2 paper. Mark has worked on climate variability, climate change, innovation and adaptation issues for over 30 years in partnership with many industry, community and policy groups. Issues he has addressed include agriculture and food security, the natural resource base, ecosystems and biodiversity, energy, water and urban systems. He's been a major contributor to the IPCC since 1991, with roles in the second, third, fourth, fifth, and now sixth assessment reports, sharing the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize with other IPCC participants and Al Gore. It's my great pleasure to welcome Mark tonight to summarise the key findings from the IPCC's Working Group 2 report. If you have questions for Mark, please put them in the Zoom chat, and we'll have a joint Q&A after our second speaker. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, David, for that introduction. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Ngunnawal country tonight. So I'll just share my screen just to get this going. And that should be full screen now. Just thumbs up, David. Excellent. And so I'll be covering just the Working Group 2 report, which is about 3,600 pages of densely written text. And so I'll be doing a very quick skate over a very, very complex area. And the sort of question that I'll be asking essentially is encapsulated in that photo there. Is this the question? Is this the sort of future that we're heading into, or is this the future that we want to head away from? And I'll try to answer that as we go through the presentation. So the first thing a point I'd make is that you may hear some politicians saying we're on track to deal with climate change, etc. It's simply not true. It's not true globally, and it's not true nationally. At a global scale, this is what this graph shows. This is from the IEA, the International Energy Agency, and it shows carbon dioxide from industrial and electricity sources going back to 1900. And you can see that there's been a long, steady increase, and last year was the highest on record. We're not starting to turn this curve around and go downwards, and we have to turn it around. We have to turn this around and head downwards to the zero line by around about 2045. And we're not simply on that trajectory. And just to give a bit of a feel, global financial crisis, you can see how little difference that made. COVID made a bigger difference, the single biggest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but that bought us roughly 2.5 weeks of time before we'd actually get to a carbon dioxide concentration that's equivalent to driving us to 1.5 degrees. So all of that pain and suffering in terms of reduced activity, reduced transport, etc., buys us virtually no time at all. And again, to give it a bit of context, you can see that dip associated with COVID. That variation associated with COVID was actually greater than the total greenhouse gas emissions back in 1900, just to tell you how radically we've been so good at pumping out fossil fuels across the earth. Now, what happens with those fossil fuels when we combust them in, say, in our car or in a coal-fired power station, is that they build up in the atmosphere. That's because, roughly speaking, half of every ton that we emit sticks in the atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years. And so it builds up, it accumulates over time. And the only way you can stop that accumulation is by essentially taking that to zero, net zero. And so that's where that net zero comes from, that you might hear various people, politicians, industrial people, and scientists talking about. But at the moment, as I said, we're not getting there. Our carbon dioxide concentrations are now 419 parts per million. That's the highest in at least 2 million years. If we look at other greenhouse gases like methane, nitrous oxide, and others, they're again at record levels. So we're simply not turning the good ship climate change around at this point in time. And we've known since the 1800s that if we put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we'll warm the earth. So it's not new science. And what we're observing is exactly what our science would say. So we've actually observed a very significant and clear human signal in global temperatures. That's what this graph comes from, the IPCC Working Group 1 report, which just shows on the bottom essentially the best estimate of natural variations in temperature going back to 1850. And then on the top line, the sort of more orangey coloured one, it's when you add in the human influence. And you can see that there's clear space between those. There is a clear, unequivocal human influence on climate change. And in fact, we can ascribe almost all of the observed temperature increase to human activities. And those temperature increases, along with changes in rainfall and extreme events, etc., have impacted everywhere across the globe. So this is a key graph from the IPCC Working Group 2 report, the one we're talking about tonight. And what that shows is that we have seen observed impacts of climate change on every continent, on every island, in every ocean, in every sector of our economy, every part of our natural systems across the globe. So it's absolutely pervasive and it's really significant. So just as one example of how significant that is, recent studies show that if it wasn't for climate change, on average, our agriculture across the globe would be about 20% higher than it currently is. And that 20% isn't evenly spread across the globe. Most of the places with really bad reductions in agricultural productivity or potential due to climate change are in those places where there's huge numbers of hungry people. So in the absence of climate change, we probably would have far, far fewer hungry people across the globe than we actually do. That's the impacts it's having right now. We don't have to wait for 20, 40, 50, 60 years. It's actually impacting really significantly right now. And that's what one of the key messages from this report. Here's the two maps of what the world might look like if we let climate change rip and have around about a 4-degree warming. So that's higher than our current policies would indicate, but within the bands of uncertainty. If we look at the temperatures, temperatures are going to go up differently in different places. So Arctic and Antarctic, a lot higher than in other places. The land areas higher than in the oceans. The inland parts of our continents higher than the coastal areas. And if we look at rainfall, which is so critical in Australia, as we know, and people will talk about later tonight, is that climate change is already impacting on that, and it will impact further. So on average, what we see is enhancement of the water cycle. In fact, the water cycle is going up twice as fast as the global climate models would predict at this time and these greenhouse gas concentrations. So it's actually accelerating much faster than any of our models would actually predict. And if we look out to a 4-degree world, there's big parts of the world where there's more rainfall, so Central Equatorial Pacific and Arctic and Antarctic, but big areas of the world where there's much less rainfall. So Central America, Mediterranean zones, South Africa, South America, and Australia. And so all of those things drive big change. And some of the changes that I've just identified here is changes in extreme events. We've already started to see this happen. But things like fire, storms, floods, heat are likely to be much more frequent and more severe than they have in the past. And in fact, a recent study showed that a child born now would actually go through 3 to 4 times as many extreme climate events as their grandparents did. So something that was unusual for their grandparents to live through is something that's going to be commonplace for the children who are born now. And that's going to be commonplace for them to have to clean up the mess and pay for all the damage that costs. Climate change is already hitting humans, and it's likely to hit harder in the future. So things like heat stress, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute, vector and foodborne diseases, food and water security already challenged, air pollution getting worse, mental health increasing both when chronic events and acute events, labor productivity down, economic prosperity down, so reductions in GDP. There's not a lot of good news stories from climate change, particularly in a country like Australia. And of course, there's impacts on biodiversity and our natural resource base, particularly on water-based ones. Now, I just want to pick out 2 areas of impact, and I could choose many, many hundreds of different areas tonight, but I'm just choosing 2. One is related to heat and the other is related to water. So this is a graph. I don't expect you to read all of it. I'll tell you what message I want you to see from this, but this is a key graph from the IPCC Working Group 2 report. What that shows is across different geographical regions, global or various continents or various other regions such as mountain regions, so geographical aggregates. And against there's impacts of climate change on water, on human health, and on things like cities and infrastructure. And it breaks those down into subcategories. Now, if you actually look at each of those cells, that's what the evidence is of likely impacts of climate change on that particular sector in that particular region. And importantly, in all of those cells, there is not one single cell that only has a plus in it, that only says the evidence shows that climate change brings benefits. At best, there's pluses and minuses, but most of the cells, the majority of cells, have minuses in that, which is the majority of the evidence is that climate change will have negative impacts for that sector in that particular region. Now, I just want to pick out one, which is heat. And if you look at that, what it indicates is across every one of these different geographical slices, it's only negative impacts. And if we actually want to look at what that might mean, we look at this graph on the top left-hand side, that's the historical frequency of heat stress days. These are days when heat and humidity make it quite dangerous for people to be active outside without access to some form of cooling. And if we look at the bottom right-hand corner, we actually see what that would look like under a high emission scenario towards the end of the century. Huge areas of the world and huge populations of the world essentially would have every day becoming a heat stress day. Every day being potentially dangerous to be outside and active, operating in a farm, operating a tractor, walking your kids to school. And if you look at Australia, Australia's not immune. Right across the top end, almost every day becomes a heat stress day. And those conditions which historically were experienced in Darwin, you know, like hot, sticky, drive you nuts type conditions, will be experienced right down half of the continent. So really, really big changes. Now, the thing is that these changes are systemic. They just don't apply to one thing. They apply to many different things. So these are just some of the columns in this particular graph that heat has particular impacts on. So if we go from left to right, water scarcity. We know if it's a big heat event, both our demand for water goes up and our supply for water goes down because we've got increased evaporation, often drought conditions. In terms of agricultural production, if it's really hot, your crops shrivel, they run out of soil moisture, and also that it accelerates the internal clock of those crops and they yield less, considerably less, for small amounts of temperature increase, surprisingly. If you're an animal production person, is that high temperatures really damage productivity and can kill your animals in extreme conditions. And we still get that here in Australia. Or if you're a fisheries person, you might have conditions like in Tasmania where it's already getting too hot in the water for effective production of salmonids, the nice pink fish that we get in the supermarket. Climate change is already impacting on infectious diseases. Almost any infectious disease, the growth of those organisms goes up exponentially with temperature. And we also have mental health, as I mentioned before, both acute and chronic impacts. And lastly, on the right-hand side is damage to economic sectors. There's really good evidence that as the temperature goes up, economic productivity and labour productivity goes down. So we have to think of these things not as individual things hitting heat stress for an individual person, say out in Penrith. It has huge systemic impacts right across the system. Now, these are what we call burning embers diagrams. They're essentially color-coded risk diagrams. These ones are particularly for heat. And the reason why I show them here is to drive home a couple of points. The first point is, what does this mean? The color coding is if it's white, there's basically no increase in risk of heat related mortality or sickness. But as you go to higher temperatures, to 1.5 or 2 degrees, you go up into the red zone, the yellow zone, which is moderate increase in risk. Red zone is high risk. And then right at the top, that sort of purpley color, that's basically unmanageable and irreversible risk. And at the moment, our policies across the globe are driving us to around about 3 degrees. And you can see that 3 degrees, if you don't adapt, will lead to essentially unmanageable and irreversible risk in terms of heat. These other two columns indicate what happens if we adapt effectively. And you can see that there's, for any given temperature, there's a significant reduction in risk associated with heat events. But that assumes that we can adapt. In many parts of the world, there simply aren't good adaptation options. And if we look at what's going on in terms of heat waves have already intensified in cities, where they've also aggravated air pollution, which kills tens of millions of people a year. The observed impacts of heat are also concentrated on the most economically and socially marginalized residents. And it interacts with other factors, including urban crime. And so you get double and triple whammies coming out of this. Now, in terms of water, just one picture. This is the changes in average runoff per degree Celsius increase in temperature. So we're already at 1.24 degrees above pre-industrial. So to get your estimate of what this would mean for current conditions, you multiply these numbers by 1.24. If you think we're going to a 3 degree world, you multiply these numbers by 3. And you say, okay, so you look at the Murray area down in Victoria, multiply 19 by 3, you get roughly 60% reduction in our water, in our dams and rivers. And you might think, wow, that's really serious. It is, but we're already hitting 40% reduction in Murray flows due to climate change. And if you look across the southwest of WA, 50% per degree. 3 degrees means you've lost all your water apart from the big floods that come along. And you might say, well, that's pretty radical, but they've already lost 85% of the inflows into Perth's dams due to climate change. So if anything, a lot of our projections for change are underestimates of the change. Now, like we do as a species in the front of any threat, we adapt. That's what humans do. That's what we're good at. And it's the same for climate change as anything else. But if we actually think about this and frame this, is that what we see, that evidence that I showed you and much, much more, is that climate change impacts are potentially very large, they're very systemic, they're happening very rapidly, and they're largely negative. And rationally, our response needs to address those characteristics. Our response in adaptation needs to be large, it needs to be systemic, it needs to be rapid, and it needs to be very positive. It's a fairly straightforward narrative, and it's really hard to understand why that hasn't been picked up in the public discourse in Australia. Unfortunately, when we actually look at what's happened in terms of adaptation, including in Australia, is that because of that public discourse not picking that up, we're actually falling way short of where we should be in terms of adaptation. There's a big adaptation gap. So most observed adaptation is fragmented, it's small in scale, it's very incremental, so it's just tweaking existing systems. It's often very sector specific, not integrated, and designed to respond to short-term concerns, including climate variability rather than climate change. And often it's more about planning and talking than it is about action, implementation. And unfortunately, Australia is rating less and less well in terms of our performance on adaptation and adaptation research. Now, in this working group report, to pull all of this together in terms of adaptation, so here's a bit of good news finally, is that what we did was look at what the evidence was for effectiveness of different forms of adaptation across different sectors. So these sectors are listed down the left-hand side: land and oceans, urban infrastructure, energy, and cross-sectoral things like insurance. And I'll just zoom in a little bit so it's easier to read. But what we did for each of these sectors, we looked at specific broad classes of adaptation, like forest-based adaptation or sustainable aquaculture or sustainable agriculture. And we looked at how feasible are these given our current state of knowledge, and also how consistent or much synergistic they are with emission reduction. So can we put in place adaptation responses to climate change and also reduce our emissions at the same time? So the feasibility was assessed against those 6 different characteristics on the right-hand side, economic, technological, institutional, etc. So we pulled together all of the literature which actually supported how feasible these adaptations were and aggregated them into that one dot. Of course, there's huge complexity in there, and it's a very much simplification, but it sends a message, and the message is that almost all of these adaptations have some degree of feasibility, and almost all of these adaptations, if done well, can actually reduce our greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. So we can have win-win arrangements. But to do that, we have to move from feasibility to action. And what we found in this report was a whole series of characteristics which were really important if we're actually going to do that action-based change. And Catherine's going to talk about some of this after me. So some of them were enhanced knowledge. So people who understand the pros and cons of different options are much better placed to make good decisions. Political commitment. Consistent political commitment allows people to make decisions in more confidence. Institutional arrangements that support integrated action instead of just sector-based action or regional-based action without looking at the interactions with other sectors or with mitigation. Adequate finance. Only 4 to 8% of the global climate finance actually ends up helping climate adaptation. Most of it, the vast majority, goes towards emission reductions. And yet adaptation is the thing that most people, particularly in developing countries, want action on. We need to build capacity. We need to monitor and evaluate. And in the business world, big business, this is just becoming good practice, what's called the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It's becoming just mandatory if you want to play in the big games in investor world. And lastly, inclusive adaptation was seen to be really, really critical to get good results. Having effective engagement processes and having a very strong focus on equity and justice issues when we're actually starting to do our adaptation journey. But really important to emphasize that this is about risk reduction. It's not about risk removal. Even if we do adaptation well, there will remain residual risk. And so my last slide here is just, again, notes of caution. There's lots of things we can do, but we need to understand some of the limitations to those things. So one of them is this report shows for the first time that the effectiveness of adaptation decreases as temperature goes up. Our menu of adaptation options shrinks and the effectiveness of those adaptation options declines. So the longer we leave it to take action, the worse and worse it gets. We get more climate change and less ability to adapt. There are limits to adaptation. So sometimes you simply can't keep on adapting. And I think Catherine will talk about some of those soon. And some of those can be overcome, but some can't. And there's also opportunities for maladaptation. That's perhaps adapting too soon or too late or in the wrong way, by the wrong people, using the wrong sets of values. And that can generate a whole series of recognizable problems, such as locking in to futures that you don't want, short-termism that limits the vision of what can be done in terms of adaptation, so you don't make the right investments, or entrenching existing inequities. And all of these things can be avoided if we actually do these things well, if we have flexible, multi-sectoral, inclusive, and long-term views of adaptations, and if we seek solutions that have broad benefits, not just climate adaptation benefits. And this is the last of these figures that I'll show, but it's exactly the same sectors and adaptation options as I showed before. But in this case, it's mapped against the Sustainable Development Goals. That's the 17 goals that all countries across the globe have agreed on in terms of sustainable development. So you could think of it as ecologically sustainable development. And what you can see there is almost every one of these adaptations is synergistic with those goals. That adaptation helps achieve sustainable development, and sustainable development, if done well, helps adaptation and emission reduction. And the last point that I'd make is that there's increasing evidence that the costs of inaction on climate change far, far outweigh the costs of action. If anything, it's just a simple economically rational decision to avoid the worst climate change outcomes because it costs us economically. But then there's a huge range of other costs which aren't included, including human costs and environmental costs and future option costs for our children and grandchildren. So the message here is there's lots we can do. We're not currently doing it, but we can pick up this ball and run with it hard. And we're well placed to do that in Australia.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. I'm just stepping in for David, who I think is just having a quick tech issue. But thank you very much. That is a lot of very clear, very powerful messages and information from an incredible amount of work. And it's a lot to take in. And I'll pass to David, but I do want to share my thanks, and we'll transition now to what we can do about it. Over to you, David.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, everyone. My laptop completely died, and I've just gone through a full reboot. So I was calling in on my phone, so I've managed to catch most of Mark's speech. It's a fantastic talk, and please put your questions into the chat, and we'll get that Q&A going after Catherine's talk. So it's now my very great pleasure to welcome our second speaker for this evening. Catherine Kerr leads information delivery for the New South Wales Government's Climate Resilience and Net Zero Emissions branch, which they call CRANS, and that includes managing the Adapt New South Wales website and increasing resilience to climate change community grants. Catherine is a science communicator who's worked for the Queensland and New South Wales governments for over 15 years in the fields of climate change adaptation, coastal management, and geographical education. She has a marine science degree from the University of Sydney, a master's in coastal engineering and management from UNSW, and a diploma of education and geography from Southern Cross University. Catherine is passionate about climate change and believes in the power of human-centered design to communicate, educate, and drive the transition to a climate-secure and socially just future. She lives in northern New South Wales with her young family, loves to surf, camp, and hike whenever she can. Obviously, she's had a lot of first-hand experience recently with the terrible floods in the Northern Rivers region, and I guess community resilience building is top of mind there. So as I say, please put your questions into the chat. And I think, Catherine, I'm sharing my screen for you. So let me just do that and then over to you.
Thanks, David.
All right, is that coming up, Nick?
Yep, perfect.
Right.
So thank you so much for the introduction, and also Mark for his talk before. Yeah, I always, even though I write about climate impacts, you know, frequently, when I hear it in front of me, it's always quite, yeah, sobering. So yeah, fantastic presentation. Thank you. So I'm here today to talk about community climate change adaptation and how communities can create new futures together. And as David introduced me, I lead information delivery for CRANS within the New South Wales Government. And we've actually just moved into the Treasury portfolio. So there is a new Office of Energy and Climate Change within the New South Wales Treasury. So it's actually quite an exciting time for climate change and action on climate change in New South Wales. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to quickly talk about my experience of climate change in northern New South Wales, and the region that I've lived in for about 13 years now. So the photograph on the left is one of my favourite photos taken out of the plane, not by me, but of the bushfire smoke at the time of the Black Summer bushfires. And I know that everyone in this room will have some memories of that time and how traumatic it was across Australia, as well as a lot of places down the East Coast. And on the right is my son, who was 5 at the time. And I remember going down to the beach, and it was just this really eerie, kind of creepy, just horrendous time. And you can see the ash in the background on the beach there. And I took that photo because I just wanted to have it clear in my mind that this is not the future that I wanted for my son. Next slide, please. And so my other most recent experience of climate change in this region is floods. So I've lived through quite a few floods here. We had bad floods in 2017, and then again, the most recent flooding disaster, 2 floods within 3 weeks, I think it was. And so again, one of my favourite photos on the left, which is a church in Lismore, quite a biblical kind of photograph there of the flooding in Lismore. And the photo on the right is of my 4-year-old son in Ballynudgel, which is a town very close to me, to where I live, where my son goes to daycare. And that was actually taken the day before the serious floods happened. So the next day you couldn't even get into the town, and the water, I think, came above where that house has been elevated to. So the flooding disaster here has been, yeah, there's not really words to describe it. It has been a very just awful time to live through, and the community-led recovery and also during the emergency has been something that has, yeah, just been incredible and continues to inspire and astound me. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to really quickly talk about mitigation, adaptation, and the synergies. And so Mark talked about this in his talk as well, but you can see on the left, we have mitigation strategies. And so mitigation is just about reducing carbon in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases to get to that net zero. So you can see it's mainly dependent upon decarbonising our energy system. So clean energy, low emissions land use, low emissions industry, so batteries, solar, wind, hydrogen, and sustainable transport, electric vehicles, things like that. Then on the right-hand side, we have adaptation strategies. So we have things like emergency and disaster preparation, Aboriginal land and sea country management, which is very important in how Australia is adapting to climate change. Planning for our future climate, so looking at climate projections into the future and being able to use that information to mitigate our risk. And then climate resilient infrastructure and building design. And as Mark was talking about, there are lots of synergies. So you can see the mitigation and adaptation synergies in the middle are both have co-benefits and are both related to each other. So you've got urban greening, climate smart building design, education and capacity building, so the education of our children, are both mitigation and adaptation strategies. So all of this forms equally important action on climate change. And adaptation has fallen behind. I remember going and being involved in NCARF. There used to be a national climate change adaptation research facility, which has been defunded and doesn't really exist anymore, but we have fallen very far behind with adaptation, and there is lots of room for improvement, which we're working on in New South Wales. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk about the New South Wales government's increasing resilience to climate change community grants. So we had one round of community grants worth $615,000. Interestingly is that there was, I think we could have given out 3 or 4 times the amount of that money. There were so many applications for those grants, and it just really shows that there is such appetite and so many community groups working on climate change adaptation and who are willing to take it to the next step with it getting financial backing. So 23 community groups delivered climate change projects, and the grants encouraged community participation and delivered social, environmental, cultural and economic outcomes. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about 3 of my favourite grant projects. So this first one was called How on Earth? Helping Young People Overcome Climate Anxiety. And this was an incredible project that was actually based in the Northern Rivers, so I got to actually be part of it. So it combined theatre and workshops to explore the different ways that young people are reacting to climate change and to transform those feelings of indifference, anxiety and rage into connection and action. And what was so incredible about this particular project was that you had combined a youth theatre production about climate change, which was incredible. You can see the photo on the left. And then there was also a leadership course in climate resilience. And so that supported 18 participants, 14 to 25 years old, to really recognise their strength and become leaders in their communities. And then they ran their own community climate resilience workshops, which were again incredibly impressive. Next slide, please. Another project was restoring farmland in Kapiti Valley. So there's a lot of land care groups around Australia that you can get involved with, but this one was a particularly special project because it included just a huge array of different people. So you had artists, university students from the University of Wollongong, farmers, people with environmental science expertise and knowledge of Indigenous stewardship. And so these 40 volunteers were brought together to carry out land restoration work on the 2 farms. And so some of them would stay overnight as well during the larger sessions. And so activities involved things like weaving, natural weir making, native seed propagation, and even preparing soil bacterial tea. And at night, the volunteers were able to share music, food, and stories. And so this was just such a great example of a wide range of people across different communities coming together to connect in place as well. So connecting to each other and connecting to the place that they were working in. Next slide, please. And so the final one that I'll talk about briefly is ZNet Urala, Let's Talk About Water. And so this project is a fantastic example of communities and community groups taking their climate issues into their own hands. And it's something that I've seen a lot of in the Northern Rivers recently. So during the original, the immediate disaster response, it was all about community. During the aftermath, it was all about community, cooking, supporting each other. And now in the recovery, community groups are kind of speaking up and trying to get some sort of action and lobbying for change in the area. So for this project, the particular issue was water security. And so this was during the drought. And in collaboration with the University of New South Wales, the Global Water Institute and the Council, they embarked on a project to explore different options for water security. So this was like a large community-led consultation project. So they surveyed 229 residents on 9 different options for future water security. And this was followed with 4 focus groups. So that engaged small rural landowners, town residents, and catchment landowners. And as a result of that, the councillors of Uralla Shire Council are looking at different alternative water management strategies as an outcome of their project. And we're also seeing this across New South Wales, is that council is really willing to collaborate with the community and listen to the community and just bring them on board for the journey and co-design solutions to issues in their regions. Next slide, please. So out of all of these community grants, and that was just 3 of 23, there were some adaptation principles that kind of came through. And I also adapted some of these from a piece called We Are Earth by Adrienne Marie Brown in one of my favourite publications called Atmos magazine, which I can put the link in the chat for later. So you might have heard we talk about a just transition, and that is adaptation that aligns with a future of justice and liberation. There's inclusive disaster preparation, and so that's communities of mutual aid, communication, and resource distribution. And it's also about just making sure that everyone has access to disaster preparation information. So we had another grant that worked with refugee communities, people who have English as a second language, people who may have a disability. The people that are most vulnerable in our communities are the ones that are most impacted by climate change. So it's really important that we inclusively prepare our entire population for the impacts as part of adaptation. Decentralisation. So that's caring for each other and our communities in a way that deepens our relationship with the natural world. New behaviours, which is something I'm very interested in. So how do we create new belief systems and behaviours that will enable us to survive through climate change and new patterns of survival and being in the world? Resilience, so growing and changing, growing and learning from change and suffering in the context of adaptation, and how we take that learning and resilience moving forward with our new climate. And creating more possibilities. So weaving together the best practices and lessons from past generations to expand what's possible for the future generations. And I see Indigenous land management and knowledge as being so important in this process of creating more possibilities. There is so much knowledge that our First Nations people have that we can harness, and also, you know, their worldview and the way that they have their relationship with the world. Next slide, please. So I just had a couple of quotes to finish with, which I thought were appropriate. So again, the first one by Adrienne Marie Brown. Science fiction is simply a way to practice the future together. I suspect that is what many of you are up to, practicing futures together, practicing justice together, living into new stories. It is our right and responsibility to create a new world. And the second one by Angela Davies is that I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. And so the community projects that we've seen and the community resilience and efforts that I'm seeing in the Northern Rivers really demonstrate that people and communities are standing up and not accepting the status quo anymore. And don't underestimate the power that communities and community groups have in this space, because it is huge and it is transformational. Next slide, please. And so this is the final slide. So if you want some more information on adaptation, Adapt New South Wales is an incredible resource. I'm biased because it was my project and I helped pull it together, but there's a lot of incredible information just on the basics of climate change, the causes of climate change, the impacts. So we have information on all of the different impacts and climate projections for your region in New South Wales. You can also access information on those community grant case studies, and we have written case studies and some videos as well, and we'll be publishing a lot more of those into the future. And you can also sign up for our newsletter. That's it. Thanks, David.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Catherine. That was really exciting to see some of the work that's going on there. And I guess one thing that really struck me was when you talked about both Indigenous people as being central to resilience and adaptation, and also councils, and I really think that local governments are, they're pretty much at the front lines of resilience and adaptation. So I think one thing that I'd be encouraging everyone to do is get to know your council and understand what they're doing in the adaptation and resilience space. And I believe New South Wales government has outreach to through the local government department to councils to give them some tools and things around climate adaptation. Is that right?
Yeah, so we've actually got a, we're just about to launch a climate action guide for local government. So that includes, a guide of how councils can decarbonise, so reach net zero emissions, and then also, how they can adapt and manage their climate risks. So New South Wales government does support councils. I guess the biggest barrier that we find is that council staff don't have that much, a lot of them aren't very well resourced. And I think that's why communities are really stepping up, and why council is really sort of supportive of that process as well, because if community can help do the work collectively, then there are lots of benefits.
Excellent. Well, look, I see there have been a few questions and things in the chat. So Nick, if you're right, I'll hand back to you to moderate Q&A.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Catherine. That was a fascinating presentation. There have been a few good questions come up, so I'll get to those straight away. One, just to start with, from one of our team, was just if there's any further information, or whether the adaptation grants might still be live, and whether we might be able to find some more information about those, because that sounds like a fascinating program. Yeah,
I should have mentioned that. So the grant project, there was only one round of grants. So we're hopeful that potentially in the future there may be some more, but it's not something that's on the horizon at the moment. I think Resilience New South Wales are running some large sort of state government, local government grants at the moment, and they may offer community grants into the future. So they have done too. So Resilience New South Wales is a good place to check for funding as well. And also I think private, don't be afraid to approach private sector grants and things like that. Banks put things forward. There's usually money kind of floating around in some different forms. So,
fantastic. Thank you. A question early on from Ursula was for both our speakers. We are a relatively small organisation with up to 15,000 supporting contacts, and they're all across Australia. What would you say to all of us, particularly at this time of potential political change and agency? What would you say to all of us that we could do and be thinking of at this stage in terms of empowering ourselves?
Mark, did you want to go, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I'll pitch in. Look, well, for starters, I think you actually just need to hone a message that's really important to you individually, and then you push it up the system. And the key message for me is I think we should expect a lot more from our elected representatives than we're getting. When you look at the surveys of climate change intent across Australia, Vote Compass shows climate change and environment is #1 for most people. And so the Lowy Institute survey shows that 90% of Australians want more action on climate change, and they're not getting it. So there's this huge gap between the general public and their expectations of what our polity is delivering and what's actually being delivered. And that gap is simply unsustainable in my view, and we need to close it.
Yeah, so I would definitely add to that in terms of, elected officials. It's just so important that we start taking climate action seriously. I do work for the New South Wales government, so I have been, Minister Keane has really led some transformational change in New South Wales. It's a very exciting time for climate action in New South Wales. So I think while the federal government has not been doing so much, we have been incredibly busy in the New South Wales government. But I think in terms of future planning, and I think it's really important, and you can use Adapt New South Wales for this as well, we've got information on how to adapt for community groups, business and households, and we're redoing our households content. But I think just being able to, understand what your vulnerability is. So what the climate risks are in your particular, region and your communities. Find out what community groups you can get involved with as well. Talk to your schools. So I have, offered to do some syllabus, look and see if I can add anything around sustainability and climate change. And the teachers are always, really keen for that kind of stuff. And just know how to manage your climate risk, your personal household climate risk. So yeah, I would invite you to use Adapt New South Wales for some broad information there.
Fantastic. Maybe we can get the link to the resource in the chat as well. We probably have time for a couple more. One from James, pointing to Lismore. Lismore locals have experienced unexpected obstacles to their post-flood self-help and mutual aid initiatives. How can Australian governments ensure they don't impede community-led responses to climate extremes? So I suppose this is in a response frame. Catherine, would you have a response?
Yeah, sure. So I think, well, I live close to Mullumbimby, and so there was an organisation called Resilient Byron, which is completely community-driven. It's operated and led by some, fantastic professionals. So they have that professional experience as well that they bring in and share with the community and bring community along. They've got some funding through Resilience New South Wales, through the grant project there. And they did some incredible, work during the emergency and afterwards. They've only just stopped sort of supporting and another agency has taken in. So I think what we learned from the floods is that community, just the help was not able to reach us where we needed it. And there were a lot of, different reasons for that. So telecommunications were down for 5 days afterwards. The weather was horrendous. So it's actually really difficult to get rescue equipment in. So you saw, surf lifesaving, people just who've got boats, anyone were just going in and rescuing people. So that was quite a chaotic emergency management system. But I think community-led emergency management supported through government funding is really a good way forward. So everyone, you look after your community. I know who's vulnerable in my street. I know who needs to be rescued. There's just this networks of community that really manage the emergency response, but with support and coordinated support from the authorities. And when I worked in Queensland, I used to work a lot with storm surge and cyclones. And I remember going to Cuba and doing some research, and they've actually got the most successful disaster mitigation strategy in the world. So while people in the US are perishing during cyclones and storm surges, Cuba, because it's got such high social capital, they have this system where they there's a leader and they're looking after each other, and it's all coordinated, and everyone stays safe during an emergency. So I think well coordinated emergency response by community supported by the authorities is the way forward.
Thank you very much. We might be just out of time for any further questions.
Can I chip in there, Nick?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I actually think those things that Catherine said are really important. But the other part of the picture, I think, is preparation. And so right across the globe, there's this move towards, instead of cleaning up after the mess, after the event, it's actually being prepared. So there's what's called the Sendai framework, which has that as a fundamental principle. And critically, that preparation is not just about having the boats, available to go and rescue the people, but it's actually about planning what your community might look like after an event like this. So instead of having knee-jerk reactions when people are stressed and when there's so many things going on, you actually have a plan before the event ever hits. And that's a really, really important thing, because it actually means people have made those decisions when they're feeling rational, when they're actually able to talk with each other, where they're able to have a good consultation process, not after the event when it's completely chaotic.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you both very much, and apologies to anyone who didn't get the question answered just now. I encourage you all to participate in the chat there, and I will pass on to Susie, our former National Director and current Board Director, who will take us through a couple of things that we can do today.
Thanks so much, Nick, and thank you, Mark, very much, and Catherine, for such a fantastic presentation. Really inspiring. I mean, it's obviously also difficult to hear about some of these things, but at the same time, there's a lot of strategies that we've heard from you and solutions as well. So thank you for that. So there are 2 action points that I wanted to tell you all about very briefly. The first one is, as the election's approaching in just a few short weeks, we would like you to have as many climate conversations as you can, and you've had some great information tonight from Mark and Catherine to get you started. So we on our website have a guide to having great climate conversations. So the link will be put in the chat, and so you can go there to help you in some tips, some guidelines on how to have effective climate conversations. So, you know, talk to the taxi driver, the barista, the neighbour, anybody that you can strike up a conversation with, and just talk to them about these impacts and you know, what we can do about it, and that ask them to think about that when they're voting. And so the second one resource that we would like to share with you is an amazing resource on our website for the election, which is Where Do They Stand, which is a guide produced by David and the amazing submissions team and Siobhan and others, which assesses all the parties incredibly thoroughly based on their policy platform against the main priorities that we as an organisation have around climate action. And there's some independents also who are assessed. So it's not just the major parties, and there's the minor parties in there too. So you can see it on the screen and the links in the chat. Please go and have a look at that and share that with your networks on social media and so on. I've never seen such a great assessment in all the elections I've been on, involved in terms of climate assessment. So yeah, it's very thorough. So please check that out, and that will help guide you and your networks as to who to vote for. So thank you for that, for the team who produced that. So those are the actions we'd like you to look at. Pretty much we've reached the end of the session. We're out of time. So I'll just hand back to you, Nick, to finish off for the night.
Thanks very much. And thanks again to everyone who's come along here tonight, especially to our speakers. I might just share the final minute with our speakers for any closing reflections before we all take away these activities that we can take ourselves and reflect on how we can build and rise to the big challenge of doing that amazing amount of work that lies ahead of us to build resilient communities. Over to you, Mark.
Okay, I'll say a really simple thing. It's a bit of a cliche now, but we're stronger together. We're stronger when we can share our experiences, when we can learn from each other, when we can share our values and explore what this means in terms of our actions. And if we actually do this well, we can do great things.
Catherine.
Yeah, I just think that, as I said in my talk, just don't underestimate the power of communities and the power, transformational change that community groups and individuals can have. So I would really encourage you to see what community groups are around, you know, think about like what interests you, how you feel your skills might best. I mean, Australian Parents for Climate Action is already a fantastic organisation doing great work, but there are plenty of opportunities to get involved and to just really take the lead. And yeah, just think carefully about your vote in the federal election.
Fantastic. Thank you both very much once again. And thanks to all of you for coming here tonight. It's been a fantastic turnout and a really great session. We will be providing the recording on our website, and we'll share that in our networks after the event. And feel free to pass that on along with all the other resources you've seen tonight. Thank you all very much, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks.